It always interests me when I meet young filmmakers and I'll ask, what films, what documentaries they've seen from the past that were really enjoyed, or what filmmakers from the past they admire. And I guess more often than not, I perhaps think that if you are really genuinely passionate about documentary filmmaking, you would look at those that have gone before, and often young filmmakers haven't. Um, it's a bit of a it's a bit of a burden for me, but whenever somebody says, "Oh, have you seen X?" If I haven't seen it, I will go and see it. Or if somebody sends me a link to a film, and in fact, sometimes I wish they wouldn't, but if somebody sends me a link to a film, I make sure I watch it. Um, now, my film college actually wasn't great, but they did introduce me to some very early filmmakers. Which, if you want to make documentary films, you have to watch them. O'Flaherty's like the grandfather, Grierson. Um, in Britain in the Second World War, the Post Office was making some fantastic films, sometimes using poetry and um, sometimes my own kids, if I recommend something and it's black and white, they're like, "Oh no, I don't want to watch them in black and white." But actually, some of those black and white documentaries are absolutely brilliant. Uh, Television documentaries from 20, 30 years ago might have been filmed in standard definition, might have been filmed in 4:3. We're now 16:9 ratio. But sometimes the storytelling is so good that they're absolutely invaluable. Um, what filmmakers do I would I always try to watch? Um, there has been a decline in the UK away from, you know, the idea of the documentary filmmakers as auteur. And I think that's a shame. I used to there used to be series um, on TV which were uh, kind of anthologies. Each week there'd be a film. It didn't matter what the subject was, but you'd be aware of who the filmmaker was. Anyway, BBC stopped all that, and then it all became about series, and it became about the subject title rather than the filmmaker. Um, but there were filmmakers. Um, I mean, Nick Broomfield is somebody as a documentary filmmaker that I would always look at. A guy called Grigsby, I'd always look at his films. Um, uh, the one I'm going to pull out and mention, though, is who's particularly interesting because he was so important in the history of documentary filmmaking, is actually Michael Moore. I don't think Michael Moore is a perfect filmmaker, and I think he takes liberties at times, stretching things a little bit, making choices to make a point. But until he released his first couple of very successful films, cinemas just weren't really that interested in showing documentaries. D was a dirty word. Um, there was a documentary made called Tilting at Windmills, or no, Lost in La Mancha, and it was about Terry Gilliam trying to make his film. And the only way they could get that into the cinemas was persuading Terry Gilliam to do some animation to go into the documentary so they could pretend it was actually a kind of Terry Gilliam animated film. Um, but then as soon as Fahrenheit came along and Bowling for Columbine and that took over 150 million dollars, everything changed. Why were Michael Moore's films so popular? Well, one of the key things is that he has humor in there. So important. So many documentaries are preaching to the converted or really dry. Um, I always love it in my own films if a curator can just say something funny. The recent film about Hopper, what a fantastic moment when we found some footage of Hopper being quite wry and actually smiling and actually being quite funny. People, cinema and television is supposed to be entertaining as well as educational. Um, and Michael Moore's strongest films, his personality, the way he kind of takes on authority in various different ways. So it's kind of and then he's making a point, and I tend to agree with quite a lot of his points to be honest. But you don't necessarily have to. But at least he's giving an opinion. Again, I find too many documentaries these days after 5 minutes, you know what the point of the film is, and I don't know what the next 85 minutes are doing. It's just being repetitive. Um, I don't think all these films are perfect or they always work. Um, but of course, sometimes they're talking specifically to an American audience. Maybe they don't travel as well. But broadly speaking, I think he's a tremendously important and a filmmaker whose films I would always watch. So just to name one example.